Houston Howard, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Why don't we get started? You tell us a little bit about like how you became who you are and what you're all about.
Cool. My comic book origin story. Um,
Exactly.
exactly. My background's pretty straightforward. I'm originally a lawyer, so I consider myself a recovering lawyer at this point. I haven't practiced in about 10 years, so almost completely recovered. Originally from Kentucky, went to law school in Virginia, focused on entertainment law, and then 12 years ago, transitioned out here to LA for the sunny West Coast. And much to my mother-in-law's chagrin, decided not to be a lawyer anymore and kind of get on the other side of the transaction. That put me into traditional film and television. And that then led me into a real specific niche of the industry, which is really focused on transmedia or multi-platform storytelling. And I got really sort of bit by the bug of how to tell stories that extend across platform in a way that creates an interesting little narrative ecosystem. And have been able to publish a couple books about the subject. I speak a lot around town, do a lot of stuff with the Television Academy and the Producers Guild and things like that, talking about sort of the multi-platform world. And that's how I got here.
So when you consider yourself an architect, you mean in the story sense, creating worlds?
Yeah, absolutely. Not in the physical sense. Anything that I would build would fall over quickly. But what I found narratively is that the construction of multi-platform IP is really akin to building physical structures. It's not as much creative free flow. It's very much almost scientific in a way. It's a really interesting intersection of science and art, I think, that goes into the creation of sort of the generational IP, the multi-platform IP that I'm a big fan of, and that really leads the market today. You got to have a little bit of of an architect's mind. The reason I chose that word is when I refer to myself as a super story architect or brand architect, is George Lucas, when he was a child, never wanted to be a filmmaker. He always wanted to be an architect, and he had the mind of an architect, and he approached filmmaking with an architect's mind, and was able to construct a generational brand that is now a half of a century old, and still increasing in size and market share. And so that's why, yeah, I'm a big Star Wars fan personally, so I really kind of draw inspiration about that approach.
So basically 15 seconds in, you're proving our mutual friend Steve that correct. He's like, you got to talk to this guy. So I've had this idea that I didn't share with Steve that at what point did you come in on the Star Wars stories? When did you see the first Star Wars movie?
Let's see. So I think the first one I saw in the theater was Return of the Jedi. So I think I was born after the first one. Born before or right. Let's see. Empire Strikes Back would have been what, 82. I would just been too young to have seen it in the theater. So Return of the Jedi, I think, was the first one I saw in the theater. But really, it was really the prequels that really were my first new experience in the theater.
Okay, perfect. So
Yeah.
the first Star Wars movie was the first movie my parents let me take my brother to the movies
Oh,
ourselves.
wow.
So I remember staying in line with him, and that was just, I've been to many movies, but that was just a
Yeah.
revelation.
That's
And
amazing.
one of the themes that I develop on this a lot, talk about, is there's how great something is and how it shatters paradigms. And
Sure.
kids today will look at Star Wars, and it holds up quite well,
Yeah.
but you can't understand, like, now it's so trite, everyone's at home you could already build like how many Star Wars backgrounds have you seen on Zoom lately, right?
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah.
Right, we're in our little pod racers, it
Sure.
wasn't like that, kids, it wasn't like that. It was just a
Yeah.
magical thing. You go on the screen, and you, like, half of it is just amazing that you have these space races. But
Sure.
um what I found amazing, so you first started the prequels. So the prequels
Sure,
are a huge disappointment to people like me that saw the first three movies. But
sure.
one thing that was really amazing is after all those years, we were back in the same world. So
Yes,
whether or not it was a good story or not, it's Star Wars.
of
And the
course.
thing that's so amazing since Disney took over Star Wars, a couple of those movies I think are really good movies, but they're not
Sure.
Star Wars. I don't feel like I'm in the same world. And I couldn't even tell you what it is about it. You know, like the latest movie, there were parts of it I really liked. And
Sure.
the first one where they introduced some of the new characters, some of it's really good. And
Yeah.
you even have the same actors you had in Star Wars. I don't know how to explain it. It's not the same world. Can you
Sure.
please explain to me why it is I feel that way?
Well, I think a lot of it is you lose the unique blueprint, the unique fingerprint of the creator, and you just, I mean, as much as the fans derided George Lucas with the prequel trilogy, and objectively, I think they're very poor movies overall. I watched every single one of them in the theater. I love them all just because, like you said, it's Star Wars. But I mean, if you look at it from a sort of an objective filmmaking standpoint, especially from a screenwriting standpoint, they weren't great, and they don't really hold up as well as they should. And but they had George Lucas's fingerprint on them, and part of what um, part of what holds multi-generational IP together, I think, is sort of the thematic resonance. Something I call a soapbox. It's sort of that thematic foundation that pours out of the soul of a creator. Um, that is just very unique, and it's really built around the unique perspective of the creator. If you want to transition into other artists that want to sort of carry on that legacy, uh, those artists really have to understand and connect to that original thematic foundation. And it seems like that was sort of a tough transition, I think, on sort of just a really deep thematic level, with the new Star Wars movies. Now, I think unquestionably the filmmaking standard of Star Wars has increased with the new trilogy. I mean, just the spectacle and just the everything was just so great. The acting, I mean, the fact that we could get Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley like in a Star Wars movie is crazy. And a Oscar nominated filmmaker like Ryan Johnson doing a Star Wars movie. The filmmaking prowess is there. I just don't know if they connected to sort of the ethos of George, and that's why it feels different. Not that it's wrong, it just feels different, and they're going to have to figure out how to make that transition, or or sort of legacy fans like us will remain somewhat frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't even remember which one it. So there's one of the I haven't seen Solo, and I haven't
Okay,
seen. It took quite a while till I saw the last two movies. I saw them out on streaming or what have you,
sure.
and I'm not even sure. Yeah, I think I've seen them all now at this point, other than Solo. But if you'd have told me, in my 20s,
Yeah,
that it was feasible that a new Star Wars movie would come out and it would have, it would have Luke in it, and it would have,
sure.
Han in it, and I wouldn't go.
Yeah,
Like, it's just unfathomable. I don't care how bad could this thing be. Even after the prequels, you tell me there's more Star
sure.
Wars movies, and I'm not going to it. It's just,
Yeah,
and I think, like, what I'm getting from talking to you is the reason why I saw them is to visit with my friends and to go back and inhabit the world, and I'll
sure.
take my chances with a story. How much am I
Sure.
just making that up, or how much of it is just that?
No, I think a lot of it is that. I mean, I think that we have sort of this emotional memory that is tied back to, back to certain times. And, it's like when, when sort of iconic bands change lead singers, they're singing the same songs, and maybe technically it's maybe even improved. It just feels different. And we have so many emotions wrapped up to the previous singer or the previous thing that it's just tough to transition, especially when you're dealing with, the iconic characters. Now, I think one thing that's really going to help Star Wars as a franchise is the shift, and I don't know if this is Bob Iger or Kathleen Kennedy or both, the shift away from the Skywalkers and Han Solo, Princess Leia, and sort of all that the Palpatine sort of arc that they were dealing with. I think now moving into new territory with something like The Mandalorian and the High Republic part of the franchise that they're rolling out initially through publishing and then probably through video game and then ramp up to film and television. I think dealing with new parts of the world, new characters, you're not dealing with any sort of legacy thing. That I think is going to liberate and unshackle sort of a new era of storytelling. I think they were trying to do something new, but at the same time they were held back to the old, and it just made it for a little bit of a wonky ride. Now, me personally, I ended up loving Solo. I think Solo is great. I think there was production issues on Solo that caused sort of the PR environment to be bad around it. I also think that one of the biggest missteps Disney had was releasing Solo just a few weeks after Avengers Infinity War and Black Panther, and there was sort of this franchise fatigue, and Disney properties began to cannibalize each other. It was a windowing issue. But if you look at just the quality of the filmmaking that Ron Howard was able to kind of pick up the pieces of Lord and Miller and accomplish, I felt that it had a very Star Wars vibe to it, and I think that was probably because Ron Howard sort of fits in with the Steven Spielberg, George Lucas sort of universe of filmmaking. And so if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to see it. I think you will find a familiarity with it that would probably appeal to you. As long as you're not, yeah, as long as you're not looking for, the guy's not Harrison Ford, right? And you can never replace Harrison Ford. And if you're not looking at him as he's supposed to be Harrison Ford, then it's a really fun Star Wars adventure and good filmmaking at that. So, but I'm looking, I'm sort of the ever optimistic Star Wars fan, unlike the millions of Star Wars fans on Twitter that seems to just hate everything. I'm very much more optimistic about where this thing can go now that you kind of unshackle from the old.
Well, my theory about it is it has to do, like, your first movies were the prequels, and
Sure.
that was your formative experience. My first movie was the first Star Wars movie, so
right.
there's a different level of expectation. But
100%.
interestingly, what you're saying, you've seen The Mandalorian, I take it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's in the Star Wars world. That really feels that felt authentic to me. I don't need to hear more about Princess Leia and more about Luke or any of them. I'm perfectly happy to see some new characters, but it's very much inhabiting in that world, it feels like.
Sure. And I think that to credit to Jon Favreau and, and he's been able to get in there and do that. And it's tough, right? It's really tough to kind of bring that same vibe of the original creator to bear. I mean, it's just, even with Harry Potter, like J.K. Rowling is so much a part of that if Warner Brothers would ever try to do a Harry Potter extension of the brand without sort of J.K. Rowling's input, it's just naturally going to feel different. And you have to be cognizant of that. And there's going to be some
Mystical Beasts franchise.
Well, I think she's still involved, but that's about as close as you can get to it, and that's a problem. It just feels different, right? I think Peter Jackson was really able to with his connection with the Tolkien estate, really do a good job with the Lord of the Rings films. But what's going to be interesting is to see how Amazon deals with the Lord of the Rings TV show. Are they going to be able to kind of connect to the pathos and the ethos of those movies and the franchise itself and the original creator? I think you have to understand the place that George was coming from at that time, and that he created Star Wars, what he wanted to say, and sort of his unique commentary, his soapbox that he was using, and what was important to him, and you have to be able to sort of access that, and a lot of it, I think, too, is that fans don't really understand that, and so that's why younger fans that sort of came into the the prequel trilogy or even after, they have different expectations of what they think Star Wars should be, and a lot of times you see fans differ with the creator, and it's a crazy thing.
That is, yeah. I mean, imagine you got all these fans that have expectations, so you can't tell new stories. You see that with the bands that get frustrated. They want to play their new material, and they're like, no, play the thing you would play 20 years ago, right? Exactly.
Sure. Right.
So now you teach people how to, or you architect the stories, or I mean, I know you're a professor as well, so you're teaching
Sure.
people how to architect stories.
Yeah, both. So I do sort of multi-levels of education. Primarily, I teach at the Los Angeles Film School. I also teach at the Art Center of Design in Pasadena. And then I do professional level teaching with the Producers Guild, Television Academy. And, I work with novelists and people like that in the video game industry as well. And so, and then, I'm creating on my own, me and my company. And so, so sort of, both sides of it. And I found that teaching people how to do it is helpful for me professionally. It just keeps the tools sharp. But what I've found is that when you approach multi-platform transmediated IP, by looking, and this is sort of where my lawyer skills kicked in like years ago, is if you look at if you just study, do a forensic audit of someone like George Lucas, J.K. Rowling, George R. R. Martin, J.R. Tolkien, and you start to just forensically audit and rip apart sort of the creative decisions and the business decisions that they took and were able to execute and apply in their projects, you start to see a lot of common denominators, both creatively and also business wise and strategically. And so early into my career, I really I wanted to ultimately create things that I was a fan of. And so I'm a child of sort of the mid 80s, early 90s. And so I'm a fan of, I grew up a fan of G.I. Joe, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Transformers, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars. And so my generation was that sort of multimedia franchise sort of generation with the Saturday morning cartoons and the comic books and everything in between. And so when I wanted to get into creation, I wanted to create stuff that I was a fan of. I wanted to create things that that I was sort of I grew up on. And when I tried to do it, it was very difficult, and it was a struggle. So because it's not an easy thing to do, but when I started to look at, okay, let's figure out how Lucas did it, how Rowling did it, George R. R. Martin, all these folks, and let's see the creative decisions that they made. There are through lines that are there. And, being the genius that I am, I just said, hey, if these people did these 8 things every single time, I'm going to just do those 8 things every single time. And I was able to kind of put together a little bit of a rubric for myself, like a creation process. And that led me to write my first book. I wrote it a few years ago called Make Your Story Really Stinking Big, published it through Michael Weesey. And it was basically the creative process that I didn't create, but I sort of extracted from these giants in the field and was able to kind of just put it together in a creative process. And that was one of the first books on the market that helped creators of all kinds, whether you're a playwright, a novelist, a filmmaker, shepherd an idea into sort of a multi-platform plan. And then since then, a couple of years ago, published my new book called You're Going to Need a Bigger Story. That's sort of the updated version of that. And so I've been able to kind of do a lot. I speak all over the world with, going to different professional events and different universities and really just talking with people and helping them make the right creative decisions and the right business decisions and find the intersection between the two to then execute an idea that can exist in a multi-platform world, in a multi-platform model that then creates new opportunities for them and creates stuff that fans that that are 21st century fans, this is the type of entertainment that they're used to.
So you basically reverse engineered the most successful storytellers and worked out the process, right?
100%, right? And that's exactly what it is. Now here's the trick: is that you still have to have a good idea. You still have to be able to execute well. And so, if there's no formula, obviously, to make a box office hit. There's no formula to make Star Wars. If everybody can make Star Wars, everybody would make Star Wars. But
Waterworld would never have happened, right?
Exactly, right? There's so many factors that sort of go into it, and you have to be able to layer the execution and the ideas on top of it. But when you have the skeleton of the framework, right, that these folks have, that gives you a leg up, and that helps. And then once you have that skeleton in the framework, now you have to begin to layer on your quality ideas, and then you see, how good of a storyteller you are at the end of the day. If you can't tell good stories, you can't execute good stories, then it doesn't matter how the framework is. You're just, you're not executing well, you're making bad product. And so it's not going to save you by any sense, but if you're able to marry the two, the right framework with the right execution, that's when you can make something special.
Yeah. Well, it seems like your methodology and your approach is useful, even if you're not, creating story, if you're not telling stories to make them into films or movies or books. Everyone's telling their story at this point. There's so much, because, you know, since the virus hit,
Sure.
everyone's working on, how do I turn what I do every day into something I can have online? And
Absolutely.
yeah, as simple as a resume would be the story you're trying to craft about your career and what have you. So that's really interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's the same. This, a lot of people will ask me is like, well, does this pertain to anything that's not Star Wars, or do I have to tell sort of a sword and sandal epic fantasy to be able to leverage this model? And it's a hard no. I think whatever you're doing, whatever type of story you're doing, you want to try to increase the reach and the effectiveness of that story as much as possible by leveraging as many entry points and platforms as possible. And so, if you're looking at a resume, I would say you are the story, and how do you begin to express yourself and your business expertise across as many channels as possible? So I would look at your resume as one piece of a photo mosaic. And if you know what a photo mosaic is, it's a bunch of individual pictures that work together for the bigger picture, and each one can stand alone in a really interesting way, but when you put them together, they sort of form something, a greater whole. And so if you say, well, my business expertise I'm going to express via resume, but also express via podcast, where I'm giving sort of business and creative advice, or whatever your expertise is. I'm going to create LinkedIn content, and then also, I'm going to, do sort of self-help productivity tips on Instagram. I'm going to express different parts of my professional expertise in different ways, but strategically weave it all together to create an ecosystem of content. It's the exact same philosophy and approach that George Lucas did to create Star Wars. It's a very similar thing. A lot of people. So what I talk about a lot is what Lucas and Rowling and George R. R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien, sort of these heavyweights in the field. Jon Favreau is one of them. What they're doing is they're leveraging laws of entertainment, and they're looking at sort of the 21st century marketplace, the 21st century audience, and they're seeing what works and what doesn't, and they're taking those laws and they're leveraging in their favor. And so when you look up at the sky and you see an airplane flying, a 777 jet flying through the air, that it's leveraging certain laws. It's leveraging, one, there's a law of gravity that's trying to keep it on the ground, but the airplane is using the law of lift to supersede the law of gravity. And that's how the airplane flies. If you look up in the sky and see that jet flying, you say, wow, that jet's using the law of lift over to supersede the law of gravity. That's awesome. I wish I could do that too, but I don't have $1 zillion to build a jet, so I guess I shouldn't do it. It's not the right mentality, because I could take a sheet of paper and fold it together in a very specific way, throw it across the room, and that little paper airplane will use the same exact law of lift to supersede the same exact law of gravity. There's difference in budget, and there's difference in scale, and there's difference in how far it'll go, but it's leveraging the same laws. And so I look at all the heavyweights and what they're doing and say, wow, they're proving the laws of gravity and the laws of lift and what works and what doesn't. And I'm going to extract those and apply them to my $10,000 feature film, or my self-published novel with a zero budget, or my podcast that I'm producing during the coronavirus out of my bedroom. And when you approach it the same way, then all of a sudden you tap into the same laws. One of my favorite filmmakers is Kevin Smith. And, he grew up sort of a fan of Marvel and Star Wars, the same as me. But when he started making films, he was making sort of offbeat $30,000 black and white movies. But if you remember the glut of indie filmmakers in the 90s, it was a massive rush for indie filmmakers to get into the industry. He was able to cut through because he created ecosystems within his own content. His movies were in a shared universe, and he crossed over characters in a really interesting way and made that viewist universe. And when you hear him talk about it, he learned those techniques from reading Marvel comics, because he was a fan of Spider-Man, but he was also a fan of Fantastic Four, and Reed Richards knew Peter Parker, and they knew Spider-Man because they lived in Hell's Kitchen together, and like Daredevil was there too, and they all crossed over in a really interesting way. So he extracted the laws of entertainment from the 777, which was Marvel Comics, and he applied it to his little $15,000 movies, and was able to now leverage this really super interesting career out of it. And so that's the way I look at it.
So his airplane eventually became a 777, right?
100%, right? Because now, and now he's writing the new He-Man cartoon for Netflix and doing a lot of really super interesting stuff. And so he's directed a lot of stuff for the DC WB shows. And so he's doing a lot of really or CW shows, not WB, but he's doing a lot of super cool stuff because he understands that model. He's just able to kind of scale it up and down in a really good way.
Yeah, it's very cool. So I guess we're getting an example of what it's like to be in one of your film school classes, right? This is what you're.
Sure, right? Like, I usually, yeah, exactly, right. This is probably a little bit lower energy than I'm used to. I get super excited about this stuff, right? And I think the opportunities now for creators, especially in this crazy COVID-19 reset, they're so amazing and expansive. I think what we're going to see now that we're in the midst of it, and my prediction is that a multi-platform model and a transmediated model is going to be more important than ever before, because as a business person, what you don't want is a single point of failure. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. And that's traditional business. And what we're seeing now in the entertainment industry as a whole is that the two biggest ways to generate revenue in the entertainment industry, which is theatrical box office, and in the music industry, touring, those are the two biggest ways to drive your revenue. And we're seeing those disappear overnight in a sort of a COVID-19 world. And so now the studios and the record labels and everybody are have to figure out, how do I even exist when I can't rely on theatrical anymore, and I can't rely on a Chinese box office anymore, right? And they have to figure out how to diversify, hedge against. You have to hedge against sort of the risk of, what if this happens again? What if it happens next fall? And it's resetting the board in a major way. If you're on the studio level, there's a lot of panic going on. But if you're an independent creator or a creator that is building content for the studios, any sort of creator, now is the time to say, okay, the major players are going to get knocked down. The chessboard is getting, the chess pieces are knocking down. Now's my opportunity to leverage all the tools that I have at my disposal to be able to push content out there. Because the great thing about it is there's still a market for entertainment. We're consuming entertainment at a greater level than ever before. And so people are consuming tremendous levels of entertainment. So we still want stories, especially in a time of recession. People want to escape. And so there's a market for what we do, which is awesome. Now we just have to figure out, how do I put it in as many places as possible? How do I diversify my risk? How do I attack as many markets as possible? How do I create ecosystems that people can continue to enjoy on as many platforms as possible? And that's, I think, what the new world's going to look like.
Well, it's pretty interesting. Have you played much with VR and AR?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when I think about the VR experiences that I've had, one of the things that's really missing is your superpower, where there's an opportunity. Like, it's really, really cool. You might play, if you want, play one of the early ones, you play a little lightsaber game, or
Sure.
you might play tennis or boxing or what
Yeah.
have you. But you quickly come across the limitations, because even though the backgrounds are really cool, the world building isn't quite there. It's
Sure.
kind of like, did you play much Doom when that first came
Yeah.
out? Or is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was really awesome. It was really immersive, but you played it for a while, and then you became really conscious that the backgrounds are fake. The backgrounds are
Sure.
backgrounds, but they're not really backgrounds.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the newer video games, the worlds are much more real, and you have
Sure.
some of them where uh, a lot of people stop doing the actual game, and then they just spend a lot of time exploring the world. And half the
Sure.
fun is just exploring the world. So I was thinking, like, I'm a big hockey fan. There's a lot of people that love the different sports. And the thing about hockey is the experience of being in the arena is vastly different than what you have at TV. Like, watching a hockey
Right.
game is great, but it's nothing like being there. Like, there's an immersive
Sure.
something to it. And I'm wondering if the movies and the sports folks, if this is an opportunity for them to actually build out the virtual experience, because there is a way you can take, like, if you took, I'm just gonna use hockey because I know that the best. If you take all the hockey players that right now, they've all been tested, and all but six of them, it's like six of them were sick, everybody else isn't. If during a season you quarantine them all within a big hotel complex, and
Sure.
you had an ice surface, and they're all playing in the hockey, and then
Right.
you just the way our backgrounds, you and I have just sort of like, we haven't talked about it much. I mean, by the way, I choose my background different for every guest. So, in your
Oh,
case,
that's great. Okay.
stories matter. I picked that. I thought that's really what it's
Fantastic.
about, right? Similarly, they could probably, their budget would be a little bit bigger than mine, so they could probably do some cool things with the background and do some,
Sure.
right. And what if we pay the people who, instead of paying a ticket, would be maybe getting a more enhanced experience. They can really get the VR experience to the hockey game. You could do it safely with the smaller number of people, without the
Sure.
travel, without the everything. But people could really enjoy that experience. Maybe not as much as they would being in person, but right now in person isn't really feasible.
Sure.
Similarly, there's even more money in the football, more money in tennis, and
Yeah.
what have you. Um, Similarly for the story, so that maybe there's something in between streaming in your living room and being in the theater. Maybe there's some sort of VR type experience that would
Sure.
tell those kind of stories. What do you think about it? And
I, I absolutely, I absolutely agree. I think right now VR, I think, has been probably 5 years away from really being matured to scale the way that it needs to scale. I think the goggles are a little clunky. You have to have a certain powerful computer to be able to really run it effectively. Once the technology catches up a little bit more, I think in a couple of years, then we're going to see it scale. When Facebook comes out with the Black Mirror contact lenses, so you don't have to have the goggles or whatever it's going to be, that will be sort of the time that I think VR takes off. But I think this is going to accelerate it more than it would, if we had this conversation a month ago. So I think
but
people are forced into it.
if you look at people, let's say for a football game, that are paying,
Sure.
I don't know, $20,000 a year for tickets to a football game,
Yeah.
they're not spending on that. They would spend that
Sure.
money, right, for the high end VR thing.
Sure.
Is that even feasible?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think what we crave, this is just a human thing. What we crave is we crave human interaction. And this is why live events have always been, as much as people, we've seen a downturn at the theatrical box office, over the past couple of years, and people get 70-inch TVs in their homes. People still like to go out to the movies. People still like to go to the concerts, because it's more about the human experience of it than anything. If That's the thing. I'm wondering how VR is going to be able to sort of duplicate that, or even if they don't duplicate that, create a different kind of experience that is equally as exciting, because what we're seeing now is that even though we crave human interaction, we can't have it just out of safety purposes, right? And so we just need a different outlet. And I think this is going to cause an acceleration in VR and cause VR to have its own language. And one thing that I think is really interesting is, if you looked at, I don't know if you watched WrestleMania over this past weekend, they did WrestleMania without a crowd, and you see how much the crowd adds to it, to where watching wrestling without a crowd, a normal wrestling match without a crowd, is bizarre and weird and off-putting to me.
You're really watching a practice. You're not watching right?
100%,
Yeah.
right? But there was two matches that if you haven't seen them, you should go back and look. Where it was the Firefly match and then the Boneyard match with the Undertaker and AJ Styles. They didn't shoot it like a normal wrestling match, which is sort of the hard cam and then a couple cameras on the floor. They shot it like a movie, and they shot it like a TV show, and they produced it over the course of 5 days, and it looked sort of like a low budget horror film with the Undertaker match, and it was really super interesting, and it was still wrestling, but this new COVID-19 thing forced them to change the entire experience and figure out a new language and the poetics of how to produce something without a crowd. So I think this lack of a crowd in the music industry and in the theatrical space in films and in sports is going to force people to say, we can't just do the same thing over and over again. We need to come out with a new language. If you look, and this isn't a new thing, if you look at sort of the early days of vaudeville, early vaudeville was when they invented movie theaters. They would just take a camera and film a stage play, and it never was quite, it wasn't as good as when you saw it live. And it took them a little bit to kind of figure out, okay, with film, we don't have to just film a stage play. The new language of film is we can cut and have a different angle. And once they started to kind of figure that out, and you have that sort of that classic movie of when they did the cut and the train was coming straight at the audience freaked out. That's when they begin to learn the language of film, because they weren't just trying to repackage sort of a stage experience. I think that's what we're going to see now in sort of a post-corona world is, what's the new language of VR? What's the new language of entertainment? Because we just can't, if we just try to duplicate what we were doing before, it's just not really going to work because the model's changing.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is the way language moves. You got to take your audience along with it. Sure. I think you had a time machine and you went back, you were able to take a modern movie and take it back to the 40s. I don't think it'd be understandable what the storytelling is saying.
Yeah, not at all.
Right? Like sometimes I had this conversation with Steve as well around how common you go back to stand-up stuff that I was howling about in the 70s. Sure. It's not funny anymore. And many shows just don't hold up. Some do, some don't. But what's so interesting is like even slapstick, what of the language used to be funny and isn't? And it's not the words, it's just like, what are the memes that used to be funny that they're played out?
Sure. 100%, right?
Yeah. So like
this is why I refuse to go back and watch anything from my childhood, because it's preserved in my mind as like these epically amazing things. And every time I've tried to go back and revisit these things that I loved as a kid, then I'm like, oh, that's not quite as good as I remembered, or that's not quite as effective as I thought. And so I just like leave it just encased in amber in my memory and just try to move forward with it. Right.
Well, if my daughters are watching this, please forgive me, but I remember when they were, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years old, they had their Spice Girls phase.
Okay. Yeah.
And have you seen the Spice Girls movie?
No, absolutely not.
It's horrific. It's just, if any of the Spice Girls are watching, I think you're great, but no, this was just horrific. So I took them to the theater, and for them, it was a religious experience, like watching Star Wars for me. And they were just such a good time. And we're done. And they were like, Dad, can we go see that again? And I looked at them like, no, I love you. No,
that's awesome.
Right?
Sure.
So we had this conversation 10 years later,
Yeah.
It's, oh God, it's been a while now, and my older daughter's like, Dad, Spice Girls was not that bad a movie. It was really good, Dad. I'm like, no, honey, it was not good. And she's like, it really was. Like, I'll tell you what, I think it's streaming on Netflix. Let's watch it tonight.
Wow.
And she goes
Yeah.
back, and she lives in New Orleans, so she calls me back up, and she's like, okay, Dad, I'm sorry. I have new respect for how much you love me and what a good
Sure.
father you are that you took me to this. I can't believe I thought this
That's
was
awesome.
great, right?
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't hold up. Spoiler alert
Doesn't.
for those of you that are going to watch this.
I'll take it out of my queue. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, but like it did for. I don't think it would hold up for 10-year-old girls now either.
Sure.
You know what I
Sure.
mean? It sort of hit the moment, and it
Yep.
spoke to them then, and just like certain dolls and certain action figures, like like the He-Man stuff, or
Sure.
do you know who Evel Knievel was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, my big present was that I got an Evel Knievel motorcycle, and my frustration was I couldn't make a jump the way that the kids on the
Sure.
commercial could. It didn't make any sense, didn't do that. But, it was like a disappointing toy. But
Yeah.
if you look back on these toys, you can't understand, given what you can play with now in terms of video games and
Sure.
reproduction, and you can buy little hovercraft Star Wars stuff, or different,
Yeah.
like it actually flies.
Yeah. It's incredible.
The stuff you can do, and the motorized motorcycles and the motorized stuff, it's hard to understand this stuff, but at the time that was like the coolest present, is a little Evel
100%.
Knievel that you just ramp up and
Well, it's interesting with sports is right now there are no sports, and so SportsCenter and ESPN and what are they doing? They're showing sort of old classic games, and even going back and watching old basketball games from the 80s or the 70s, and it's like not good basketball. Like it's a different language. I'm sure it was exciting then, but it's just not fun to watch now, and things change. And this is what creators have to understand is the biggest problem that I see in the industry is when creators, they get stuck, they find sort of a good repetition and a good pace for their career, and then they just kind of stick there, and they don't really begin to adapt with the times, not just in sort of their storytelling sensibilities, but also in the platforms that are popping now, and sort of how to storytell on those platforms, and being willing to explore new platforms, and figure out how to pull those things into the ecosystem. And I just talked to so many filmmakers that you mentioned TikTok to them, and they're disgusted that one, most of them don't even know what it is, and then two, they would never lower themselves to ever produce anything for something as plebeian as TikTok. But TikTok is the language of 13-year-olds right now.
it is.
And it's this sort of this, and they said the same thing about Instagram. They said the same thing about Facebook. They said the same thing about the internet. If you remember, I mean, I remember, yeah, right. Like I remember, in middle school, and hearing my teachers saying, "Oh, this internet thing is not going to be around, but for 10 years it's a fad or whatever," right? Like we all heard those predictions. We all heard the people who would say they would never carry a cell phone because it's crazy to carry a phone around with you all the time. And
I remember I was working, I was a project manager for EMI Music. I was living in New York, and a friend of mine said, the internet we had, but here's
yeah,
this thing called the World Wide Web, and I downloaded Navigator, and I spent
sure,
an evening, literally 2 hours, clicking
yeah,
from one website to another. It's called the
yeah,
web, because you click
right, yeah,
on this and you go somewhere else, and
sure,
you just
yeah,
down that, it's absurd now, right? But
it's
back then
crazy,
there was no, like Yahoo started out as like a search engine. And how did they do
sure,
that? They manually cataloged stuff. And there was a
yeah,
conversation, but that would be the best approach. God, I
yeah,
feel
it's crazy.
talk about this stuff.
I I know, it's crazy. And so there, like for me, I think one of the greatest things that creators can do is not to replace what they're great at, but to learn how to incorporate the new platforms and incorporate the new things into an ecosystem of storytelling. So I'm not telling filmmakers stop making movies and just make content for TikTok. Is as you make films, then in addition to the films you make, try to figure out how to extend the story of the film into TikTok and short stories into Wattpad, and how to pull those things into an ecosystem where they all work together, and it creates sort of funnels where TikTok fans can see reach the movie, and film fans can get an extension into TikTok and things like that.
Well, so here's a question for you as a certified, old dude now.
Sure.
I don't feel old, but you listen to me, I guess I am now. So, I look at TikTok, I'm technically proficient, and
Sure.
so I get it, but I'm not a 12-year-old girl. So,
Sure.
like, it's one thing understanding how they do what they do. It's another really speaking the language as a native.
Yeah.
So if this is let's say this podcast, and I wanted to put I don't know, 15-second TikTok out of it. What
Sure.
visually interesting? I mean, it's you talking, me talking, you talking, me talking, you background,
Sure.
me background. How do any of this translate to a TikTok, for example?
It probably wouldn't. I think that you have to understand sort of the unique context of TikTok. And I think when you say, I'm going to port my YouTube interview over to TikTok, that's vaudeville, and that's the same
Foreign,
mistake.
right?
Right. And so where something works on YouTube, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for TikTok. And so then you have to get into TikTok, and basically the way you have to learn the language of TikTok, the way to learn the language of Snapchat, the way to learn the language of podcasting is to consume, is to be a student and sit there for several hours and just watch crazy weird TikTok videos and say, okay, cool, I'm seeing what works. And basically reverse engineering, right? And you start to see a formula of, okay, I get it. And now how do I create contextual creative for that platform? I have a buddy named Bernie Sue. He created the sort of the first original programming for Twitch. And it's a really interesting TV show for Twitch. But he said something really interesting where he said, when I create for Twitch, I don't want to create something that I could then put on Twitch. I want to create something that can only be told on Twitch, which means I'm going to leverage the unique platforms or the unique aspects of the platform and incorporate it into the DNA of the show. And the unique aspects of Twitch is sort of that real-time interaction between the person broadcasting and sort of the people that are watching. And he incorporated that into the show. If he didn't do that, it wouldn't feel twitchy, if that's a word. It wouldn't feel right, because it's not leveraging the unique aspects. Tinder is a good example, actually, where you swipe left and swipe right. That's the unique aspects of the platform. They created their first piece of original content called Swipe Night, and it's a choose your own adventure branching narrative that they give you, that you see a scene and then you have two choices to make, and you either swipe left or you swipe right. And it's a really clever way to do sort of a choose your own adventure, but it's something that can only be told on Tinder. It can't be told anywhere else. And so you have to learn the language and then create for the platform, but at the same time, understand how the story you're telling in that platform ties back to your other platforms, right? So Benjamin Franklin is always quoted to say, jack of all trades, master of none. That's actually a misquote. The actual quote that he had is jack of all trades, but master of one. And that's the real quote. And that's why I always tell, especially filmmakers or novelists or whoever, I say, I'm not trying to tell you not to make movies anymore. I'm not trying to tell you not to write novels anymore. That's your masterpiece. That's your mastery. That's where you are a master. You can be a jack of all trades and still be the master of one. And it's not an either or, it's a yes and sort of a mentality you have when you pull together multiple platforms to create that ecosystem that I think broadens the fan base and sort of creates new opportunities for you.
Houston, that's devastatingly insightful. That's amazing.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Ben Franklin came up with it, but
sure, right, yeah.
You reverse engineered it and applied it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm actually finding it useful to me, because one of the things I'm struggling with is, 20 years ago, I really got the zeitgeist and how to communicate and how to understand what my audience was looking for. And now I'm like, okay, so I heard, TikTok's the new platform, and I watch it, and I'm like, I don't have anything to say in it. And like, but understand.
Sure.
So what is it? So how I'm applying this for me, what you just said is, what am I actually a master of? And then
Sure.
how do I become a jack of the TikTok trade? Which maybe I will, maybe
Yes.
I won't. But look at it,
Sure.
Instagram, right? There are a lot
Yep.
of people I want to communicate on Instagram, but the way they natively talk is not the way I natively talk. But I can
Yep.
understand like what they're really trying to communicate. It's like I've got it. I'm not hip. I'm not going to be hip.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
get what
Right.
visually I get what they're trying to say, and I get the pace of the stories and what they're trying to do. TikTok
Sure.
is I don't have the master of it, but what I get is, okay, so what if I'm really clear? Like my message is about how all of us have something to say and something to contribute. Everyone you talk to knows something more than you do about something important. And in these conversations, what I'm really grappling with is, what is the world we're coming out of outside of COVID? And what does
Yes.
each guest have to say that's going to be important to my audience to understand? What can you pull out of it? So to me,
Sure.
that's the being the master of one. And then
Absolutely.
I go out and be a jack of all trades. That's brilliant. I really love that.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Awesome.
Yeah. So you are a good teacher. Thank you.
That's awesome. I'm great. I can get you to fill out a student evaluation. I'll send the form your way.
Oh, for sure. I'll tell you what, I'll make a TikTok out of it.
That'd be perfect. That'd be perfect. Yeah, that's awesome. That's
So,
awesome.
okay. So can you talk some more about transmedia and like, so it seems like the natural place for this conversation to go. So,
Sure.
but then what do you see? So you become you're clear on what you're mastering of, and you're getting a sense of what the jack of all trades is. So then, how do you, what do you do next in terms of transmedia?
Sure. So, what I always encourage people to do is the first step is you don't have to necessarily learn a bunch of new things. I think, what a lot of creators don't like to do, they like to pick their one thing and they don't like to learn anything new. And there's so much democratization of technology. Information is commoditized. If you don't know how to produce a podcast, you don't know how to do a TikTok video, you don't know how to do certain things, you don't have to launch a website. You don't know how to do these things, but now the education is readily available. I mean, YouTube is the greatest education platform on the planet. If you need to know how to change the carburetor in a 1987 Volvo station wagon, I'm sure there's a YouTube video on it. And so we
Subscribe
have
to my
no.
channel.
There we go. Right. So I think the excuse, if I don't know how to do this, is just a lame excuse at this point, because that just means you're lazy. That just means you don't want to take the 7 to 12 to 15 hours to learn how to, do something, because all that information is there with LinkedIn Learning and all the things that we have. But let's say that if you don't want to go outside of your skill set, what I always encourage people to do is pick the 3 things that you're really good at as far as communicating, and figure out how to create an ecosystem of story that you just use those 3 things. And so I was working with a filmmaker out in New York City, and she she didn't want to go like learn how to create an app, or she didn't know anything about video games or things like that. And so my first question to her was, what are you good at? What can you do? Like, look inside your skill set. Obviously you're a filmmaker, that's great, but what else can you do? And it's rare that you ever find anybody that's only good at one thing, right? Usually everybody's good at a couple things. And she said, well, I know how to make websites, because she had a graphic design web development job in college. She said, I'm pretty good at graphic design and websites, and I'm a painter, and I'm a filmmaker. I said, great. Everything you do now, every movie you make, you should also do some sort of pop-up art exhibit where the art is somehow contextually and narratively connected to your movies, and create a website that sort of joins both of those things in a really interesting way. And then do that every single time. And you don't ever have to go outside of your skill set. But what you do is you create new entry points you create new entry points for new fans. And so maybe people that haven't heard of your movie, they get into the art exhibit that's a pop-up thing in New York City, and then they're sort of engaged with the story of the art, and that leads them to the movie. Or maybe people don't know anything about art because they're not in the art community, but they watch your movie, and all of a sudden now they see the art exhibit, and they're incentivized to explore that. Or maybe somebody just stumbles upon the website that sort of that lends itself narratively to the connecting of the other two things. And you broaden your base, you create more opportunity for yourself, and you don't put all your eggs in one basket, which is super helpful. And that's what she did. She just started doing art pop-ups with and what was cool, she kind of tied it to where the character in the movie in one of her first films was, she was an artist, and she would take the character's art that she would paint in the movies, and she would make an art exhibit as if the character was a real person all around New York City, and
Oh,
created this sort of
wow.
that contextual that way. And it was really super interesting, right? One of the things that I tell documentary filmmakers all the time is that, I mean, all of us, if you ever shot a documentary film, you get 100 hours of interview footage, and you use about a half hour of footage for the final cut, and the 99 and a half hours of unused footage just dies on a hard drive somewhere. And what I always tell them is, the first thing you should do is export all the audio of all the unused footage, and now you have 99 and a half hours of a podcast series that can go alongside of your film, or even lead into your film, as sort of a narrative type of a marketing effort that builds a community and then ramps into the film itself, right?
That's
So many
brilliant.
things you could do. Yeah, so many things you could do.
Did you see what's it called again? I was gonna say Babylon 5, but it's not that. It's the oh god, I'm getting my science fiction all mixed up. The remake of the Cylons, what's it called again? Uh,
Battlestar Galactica.
Battlestar Galactica. When
Yeah.
that first came out, they did a podcast series where they'd have some of the stars and the director watch the episode as it came out,
Oh,
and
cool.
then later they released that on the DVD, so you can repurpose that.
Right.
So every piece of content you do can get repurposed in different
You
ways.
know, my grandpa was a woodworker, and he we grew up sort of poor Eastern Kentucky, so lower middle class Eastern Kentucky, and my grandpa grew up really poor. But when he would cut wood, if you ever cut wood, remember from wood shop back in the day, whenever you're cutting things, you always get sort of these weird, like, triangular pieces that are always sort of
Yeah,
leftover.
yeah.
Most people just kind of brush those into
Dust.
a trash bag, right, and a pile, and sort of get rid of them. My grandpa would always sort of take those weird little triangle things that you left over. He would look at them and say, okay, what can I do with this? Maybe it's a doorstop, or maybe it's like I can put a few of these things together and I can hold up a shelf or something. Maybe they're bookends. And he would always try to repurpose everything that he would do. That mentality, I think, is such a good one for creators to have, because there's always verses out of our songs that we cut, or chapters out of our book that we cut out, and there's obviously deleted scenes in movies, and figuring out how to repurpose them in valuable ways. One of the coolest things that from Star Wars that they did is the original script of Star Wars. As far as the last Rise of Skywalker film, they had the Emperor broadcasting to the entire galaxy that he was alive and he's back to sort of take revenge on people.
I remember.
And but they cut it out of the film and just put it into the opening crawl, right? So there was a broadcast, but the audience never heard the broadcast.
Right.
One of the most unique things that they did is they had the actor that plays the Emperor, they had him voice that, and where you heard the podcast was on a Fortnite game, where there was a special Star Wars Fortnite event. And as the characters were playing in Fortnite, that was, I think, took place a week before the movie came out. They're playing Fortnite, and then everything slows down, and all of a sudden, the Emperor's broadcast is broadcast in Fortnite, and that you can actually hear it, and it was super cool and weird and unexpected. And then when you see the opening crawl, it said the dead speaks, the Emperor's broadcast across the galaxy. That took place in a different platform in Fortnite. They could have just said, well, okay, we had to cut that out of the script because for time, so let's just not use it. But they took the thing that they cut and they repurposed it in a different platform to make sort of a really interesting ecosystem, and that's cool.
That comes back from your whole world building thing earlier in the
100%.
discussion. So
Yeah.
I just want to do a quick, how are you as far as time? Because there's a couple other things I did want to ask you about.
I got till 4:30.
Okay, great. So it's just really enjoying this conversation. I could go on for hours with you.
Sure. Yeah.
So I guess one question I've got for you, it seems like you're pretty successful at juggling different hats, and
Yeah,
you're passionate, and you love doing what you do. How do you, like, one of the things I'm exploring is you don't lose 100 pounds in a day. It's a matter of
sure.
a little bit every day. You don't finish
Yeah,
a movie or a script in a day either. So what I call that is winning the day. So
sure.
what is it you do to win the day? Or do you see that paradigm? Are you a binger? Are you a little bit at a time? And how do you organize yourself to be successful that way?
It's tough, and this is where I work. I work well in teams, and so being able to rely on other people to be able to execute along with me helps, and other people to hold me accountable. That really helps. My wife helps me tremendously because she's much more organized than me as far as like I'm an interesting guy because I like to spin 100 plates, but every now and then I'll have this one thing that I just like super deep dive in. I'm either like way deep into the weeds or way up at 30,000 feet in the air, and it's tough to find sort of the balance of both. But I think sort of practical aspects of just making sure you have good organizational documents. I really like to start from a high level of development and develop sort of a high level aspect of what my project is or whatever I'm working on, and begin to kind of whittle down to where I want to go. And I look at what are the immediate things that need to be produced now, but at the same time I always want to be developing something that is a long-term thing. I get frustrated if I'm only dealing with the things that are of immediate attention, because I feel like it's me being reactive rather than proactive. And but you need to do that just to say, like, productive. But I like to try to balance my days with, I need to take care of the things that I need to produce. I have to produce an episode of the podcast today. I know I need to do that. I know I need to write a blog. I know I need to answer 37 emails. But at the same time, I make sure I schedule in opportunities to say, I'm going to work on the book that's not going to be out for 2 years, but I need to get a couple chapters in under my belt. I'm going to write 5 more pages of the screenplay that of a movie that I know it's not going to be produced for 5 years. But the things that I'm doing immediate are building into that sort of that long-term thing that I'm working on. And so for me, my whole philosophy is how do I create big vision of a project, and I see the sort of the large end of it, of what this thing can be, and sort of the long-term goals that I have, and sort of the bigger components of it. But most people, this is the trap that most people fall into, is they think if you have a big vision, that the only thing you can do is you have to execute big. So if you have a big idea and a big vision, the only way to move forward is to produce a console video game, or to make a $200 million movie, or to do the big stuff first. And we don't have $35 million to do a console video game, and we don't have $200 million to do the big movie. So what people do is say, well, I need to scale down my ideas and just do a short film, just do a short story or a poem or whatever. And they decide to execute small. But what they do is they scale their vision down to where they have a small vision with a small execution. So then if you make a short story that doesn't have a big vision, it's a small vision, and you execute in a small way, and if it works, there's no growth plan for it. There's no scalability to that. So what I like to do is I like to balance big vision, but where do we start with small execution? And so I have like a big Star Wars sized vision for an IP that I think will be movies and TV shows and console video games and Broadway plays and all this stuff in the future. But the way I'm going to launch it today is I'm going to start working on a narrative podcast. I'm going to put short stories on Wattpad, and I'm going to launch a really interesting Instagram account. And those are things that I know I can manage and I can do now, but I'm doing them with the mind of the bigger vision, so that as these things begin to hit and begin to get momentum, they're now scaling big. there's a growth plan that makes me feel better about the future, because I know I'm not just wasting time in the present, I'm building to something. That's how I win the day. It's a really super long way to answer your question. The way I win the day and the way I feel good at the end of the day is know that I'm executing right now, immediately, with all the tools that I have in front of me, with all this stuff. I'm executing in a way that is not only making me productive today, but I'm building to something scalable in the future. And the connection between the present and the future ultimately is what makes me happy.
I love that. So shifting to what we're dealing with in terms of, being staying at home and dealing with
Sure.
a virus, any special message for people that, like, what can they do to be productive and to get ready for when we come out and see what the new society is going to be like?
Sure. I mean, I think everybody has always said, if I only had time, if I only had, the extra time, I would write the book, write the screenplay, launch the podcast, do the thing. It's just a time issue. Now we all have time. There's no excuse anymore. We have the platforms, we have the technology, and we have the time. And so a lot of times people can get into a victim mentality. I know I can be prone to this. Is this is a bummer. It's a bummer to have to stay indoors. My little girl just had her 6th birthday party inside with just me and my wife, right? And it's easy to start to feel sorry for yourself and say, oh, why did I have to go through this? Or at this point in my career, why do I have to deal with this? I'm trying to get into entertainment, or I'm already in entertainment, and the coronavirus hits and this change in everything. What I've tried to do personally is I've tried to make myself switch out. When I say I have to go through something or I have to do this, I switch it out with I get to. And I know it sounds cheesy and it sounds like sort of professional help guru stuff, but that's been something that helps me, is that if you go to an elevator and the elevator's out, instead of saying I have to walk up 5 flights of stairs, say I get to walk through up 5 flights of stairs. And that immediately puts you in a gratitude mode of, like, there's a lot of people that can't walk that would love to be able to walk up 5 flights of stairs right now. So I need to be thankful for what I have. The same thing with this coronavirus is we don't have to go through this quarantine. We get to go through the quarantine. We have been given a gift of time and technology that is really so amazing that we have the opportunity to lean in and produce content during a reshuffling of the industry that no one's really ever had the luxury of doing before. And now's the time to take advantage of it. We were all created and put here in this time in Los Angeles or wherever we are, at this time for a reason. And it's not about feeling like you're victimized by this whole thing. It's like, what's my place? What am I supposed to do here? And we have all the tools to do it. So for me, I think this is like, listen, my family's safe, my family's healthy. I'm still blessed enough to be able to continue to work through this. So I'm not trying to minimize the tragedy that anybody's going through it, because I know, people are dying. It's a tough deal. But if you're not sick, if your family's healthy, if you're still able to continue with rent and things like that, this is the time that we can all take advantage of. This is the time that we could leverage our stories into as many platforms as possible. And the world is paying attention. We're all just sitting there consuming entertainment as much as we can. And now's the time to act. And so, now's the time to shine. So many people have been talking the talk for so long. If they only had time, we got the time. And we have the tech, right? And that's the coolest part, is like, now we like, if this would have happened 30 years ago, right, it would have been a completely different conversation. We wouldn't be having this conversation.
No,
right?
we'd be
So
at the bookstore buying books.
100%, right? So now the fact that this is going on today, man, it's such a massive opportunity, and I hope people take advantage of it, because hopefully it doesn't happen again. I mean, that's why, hopefully we're not quarantined for 3 months and we can't leave our house. If it does, that'll be cool, maybe. But now this is the time to act. And so I would encourage all the creators, all the writers, anybody who's ever thought about, I need to do this thing. whether it's learning how to draw, trying to learn how to speak a different language, we got the time. Let's take advantage of it. Because if you don't, it's not an opportunity issue. It's a discipline issue. That's everybody. People are going to be exposed, right, with this whole thing of people have been talking a big game for a long time. If they don't do it, it's not an opportunity issue. It's a discipline issue. So that's my perspective.
Wow. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Such a gift. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I love. Feel free to have me back if you ever want to do a round two.
Would love to. I think there's a lot of things we didn't talk about, so love
Sure.
to do that. Any current project you'd like to talk about before you go?
I'm just working on a couple projects right now. They're in early stage development. So working on a really cool project, a time travel project that's a really fun one that deals a lot with time travel with sports. That's a lot of fun. Dealing with another project. It's a multi-platform transmedia project about untold stories in Black history that we're really excited about. It has a lot of meaning to it. So we're just in heavy development right now. And what's good about all of our sort of larger scale industry projects being put on hold and being pushed just like everybody's are, now I'm like, I'm getting high on my own supply with this whole thing of like, now's the time. Okay, we can now focus. We have nothing else to do. Let's really kind of dive into these two projects, our time travel one and the Black and Power one, and see what we can do with it.
Well, you just put the marker out, right? It's time for
That's it.
Put up or shut up. So now that includes
exactly
and me
That's
for
it.
that matter. So
100%, man.
Well, thank you so much. Until next time.
You're welcome. All right, man. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.